So I'm going to jump right in. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about resilience, sort of putting it into words and action. So what I hope to accomplish is to help you better understand different ways to think about, define, and also even measure resilience, to become more familiar with the idea of post-traumatic growth and learn about different resilience factors as pathways to nurturing our patients. I talk about patients because I'm a psychiatrist. Resilience. So I'm going to define resilience, talk about measuring resilience, talk about post-traumatic growth, and talk about resilience factors. Just a mention about conflict of interest. We do have a patent pending here in the U.S. for something we call the Wellness Hub that incorporates some of these ideas. It's an app. Yeah, I mean, just one thing for you to think about. I'm not going to do this poll, but just when you think about resilience, what word or phrase comes to your mind? I'm not sure if it's quite this way in Germany, but it's certainly the case here in the States that people talk about resilience a lot. It's definitely a word that's out there in I think the popular discourse. So just worth giving it some reflection and see what you come up with, and if anything I have to say influences what you think about it as we go along. So defining resilience. So these are just some pictures that I like to use to think about resilience. So is using images of trees. So is resilience sort of bending in a stiff wind, or in this case a hurricane, but not breaking at all? Is it coming back to the way you were before, just exactly the same way, but not even bending? Is it actually coming back better than ever? Come back as a beautiful tropical palm tree. Those are some images to think about. Now there are lots of different, of course, definitions, both popular and scholarly, about resilience. Here's one simply from dictionary.com, which is a very say physical definition about coming back to one's original form after being bent, compressed, stretched, etc. But there are lots of other definitions from people that study and write about resilience, and this is from George Bonanno here at Columbia in New York. It's a somewhat wordy definition, but what Dr. Bonanno talks about is the idea that you basically don't bend. It's the idea that you remain kind of steady and stable in the face of a severe stress or trauma. So sort of like that tree I showed you that just doesn't bend at all. But there are, of course, other views of this. From the American Psychological Association, resilience would be the idea of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, etc. So it's an action of adaptation. Dr. Yehuda, a international trauma expert who we are lucky to have here at Mount Sinai, talks about it as there's an old advertisement for I think Timex watches here in the States. It talks about it takes a licking and keeps on ticking. That is sort of what her definition is like, but it's basically the idea of reintegrating after a trauma through a conscious effort, through insight and sort of positivity to take lessons learned and from an adverse experience. So again, she described it as an action and an effort, very effortful action to glean positivity from something bad. Dr. Maston describes resilience as involving a whole lot of different systems and as a capacity to react to a disturbance. So there, it's a little less of an action and more of a capacity. And here, resilience is a process to take resources to sustain well-being. Right? Not even restore, but sustain. So it's sort of an act of maintenance, and it's actually using multiple resources, both within oneself and without, beyond oneself. So, all these different definitions, right? There's definitely common themes. All agree it's about weathering adversity. There is some discussion, I think, about whether it's resilience is a trait something that you have, a process, something that you do, or an outcome, something that you achieve. And the truth is, it may vary with the challenge, and it may be like a lot of things in human behavior and human experience, all the above, depending on the process, the context. And it may also, what makes one resilient at one point in time may make one less resilient at another time, or vice versa. So resilience may also be context dependent, right? So, for example, a young child who is very dependent on their parent, that is, turning to a parent as a coping resource would be something that would be quite resilient, right? For a young child, it's in human nature. But being overly dependent when one is an adult may or may not be so resilient, may actually reflect lack of resilience. It depends. So there are a lot of different factors that go into what constitutes resilience. So here, putting it all together, here is a definition that I suggest for resilience, which is the ability, and this is mostly derived from my friend John DePiero, and mixed a little bit with some information from the U.S. National Institutes of Health. It's an ability to recover, grow, and adapt following adversity or challenge of any kind, right? So recover really should be the other order: recover, adapt, and grow. So bounce back and maybe even be better for having gone through a serious adversity. So going back to the image of the trees, here's an image that I like to use for resilience. And it's a concept that I heard at a conference quite some time ago, actually. But the idea would be, this is unlike the other trees that I just showed you, here's a tree that grew up along the coastline, let's say, along an ocean, so battered by, harsh conditions, sometimes very hot, sometimes very cold, sometimes very windy, maybe a lot of salt. And you can see, right, it's grown in this very curvy, non-symmetric, very distinctive way. And that's kind of how I like to think about resilience. So going through stress and having a story to tell, right? This tree has a story to tell that when you look back at those other more symmetric trees I showed you earlier, may not be so evident. And that's kind of, in a sort of more poetic way, how I think about resilience. There's also the idea of community resilience, which is the ability of a community to bounce back, basically, rather than an individual. And I think that's an important concept too. And a community's resilience has a lot to do with a whole bunch of different factors, right? So the social fabric, the economic well-being of the community before the physical and psychological health, obviously, of the population itself, how socially cohesive the community is, how involved organizations are in planning and responding to a community level trauma, and then also the role that we talk a lot about, which is how we talk about large scale traumas. Like, all these factors go into how a community can bounce back. And I always talk. I use 9/11 as an example because that's certainly one that's probably most personal to me, and then which I was quite involved. But 9/11 hit New York City. The attacks on that day hit New York City at a time when New York City was actually doing pretty well, and so on the whole, right? Obviously, there are different communities and suburbs and boroughs within the city, and different pockets where people maybe weren't doing so well. As a whole, though, economically, socially, the city was doing fine. So it was just in a better position to bounce back as a community from 9/11. Although on an individual level, as Fazal mentioned, I've been involved in the World Trade Center program. We have individuals that have suffered greatly, psychologically and physically, but it bounced back. That may contrast. For example, I've been consulting in Israel since October 7th, and my colleagues there are very interested in the analogy with 9/11, but some very big differences. Israel is coming out of the pandemic. Israel had a lot of, if you follow the news, a lot of social divisiveness around issues with the concerns about the politics of the government and decisions about the autonomy of the Supreme Court there, and also is surrounded by a lot of countries that are not friendly to it. So completely, in many respects, like the October 7th attack, aside from the event itself, as a community, as a country, Israel would be in a far worse position than the United States was, than New York was after 9/11. So that's an idea of thinking about community resilience a little bit. And here's another concept that I like a lot, which is the idea of resilience reserve. And this is based off of a study that a group did following Hurricane Sandy, which you may recall, so-called Superstorm Sandy, which slammed New York and the Northeast back in, was it 2012, I think? Yeah, I think it was 2012. And greatly devastated a lot of the shoreline in New York City and Long Island, if you know the geography here. And what they did is they went into the community to talk with areas of the Far Rockaways here in New York City, which is a fairly low income area, a lot of public housing, to ask them about their experience. And they came up with this idea of resilience reserve, which is that in this particular community, they were already spending down, in a sense, their resilience capacity before Hurricane Sandy because of all the socioeconomic challenges that that community was facing, as you might expect in a community that's in public housing and is low income. And so they didn't have as much left, basically, to deal with Hurricane Sandy. And in some sense, they even talked about, was the community too resilient before Hurricane Sandy, right? Did they do too much for themselves? Did let's say, the New York City government or the state or the federal government not do enough for them? So they were kind of spent by the time Hurricane Sandy came around, right? So I think a big part of resilience, of course, is who you were or what your community was like before an event and sort of where your resilience kind of gas tank was. And this is just to give an example of different paths of recovery that my colleagues have studied. Again, using 9/11 as an example, and the y-axis is the post-traumatic PTSD checklist, post-traumatic disorder checklist, which is a common survey for measuring PTSD symptoms, right? Higher numbers, worse PTSD. And we, in our program, we're able to follow people over years. We have people that we've followed for 20 plus years since 9/11. So that's visit 1, 2, and 3. And what you see, which I think in this graph are annual visits after 9/11, and you could see there are different paths of recovery. The top are traditional responder, police responders. The bottom graph are non-traditional volunteers that responded down at the World Trade Center site. But the important part is, which one of these curves is resilience, right? So if you follow my cursor, these top curves, you can just pick the top graph. The two graphs are similar, so let's look at the police graph on top. Here, the PTSD, this is a group that very high PTSD symptoms, and it doesn't get any better over time, right? So we probably would not consider them resilient. Here's somebody who had a group that had high PTSD. Whoops, all right, let me go back. And over time, it improves, right? We might consider that resilient, right? They're bouncing back. Here's a group that started with low PTSD, and over time, it actually got worse. Doesn't seem resilient. And here is an example of what Dr. Bonanno's example of resilience, right? Which is low, basically you don't budge. You don't really show much of a reaction, severe reaction to the trauma. You just sort of stay steady, right? So I'm not, this might be an example of, this is an area for discussion, but, and, maybe it's semantics, maybe it's not, whether this curve is resilient or this, or for that matter, could this curve up here, this high PTSD score, still be resilient? In other words, maybe they have severe symptoms, but are they still functioning pretty well, right? Or could that score have actually been higher, et cetera? So that's just some food for thought. And to go back to sort of what one brings to a trauma, right, or a disaster, right? A disaster being like a community level trauma. These are the different risk factors that will contribute to one's ability to bounce back or take away from one's ability to bounce back. So the first being the dose of the trauma, however you measure that, but that's typically about did you lose loved ones? Were loved ones injured? Are you displaced from loved ones? Did you have physical injuries? What did you see? Did you suffer economically? Were you displaced? Those are all different levels of exposure. But then there are other things about what one brings to the event, right? So that's prior experience with trauma or disaster, prior psychiatric history. Did one have mental health problems before? Were they diagnosed? How well were they treated? What was your life like before? Number 4 is extremely important, right? If people are struggling before a trauma, before a disaster, right? You don't need research to tell you that they're going to have a harder time after the disaster compared to people who were faring well before. Social support is a big one, and I'll get back to that. The availability or the lack of social support is an enormous factor in helping people to bounce back or not. And then so-called secondary stresses, which would involve such things as being displaced, far away from one's home, now or losing one's job, or even during the pandemic. An example of a secondary stress is having what, if I don't recall what it was like in Germany, right? But schools were shut down here for a while, so people had kids at home and were trying to do their work make a living at the same time. That's a secondary stress. And there are so-called unmodifiable things that may contribute to risk of severe reaction, a psychiatric reaction to trauma. One is female gender. It's debated what that means. Is it biological? Is it sociological? Is it that women tend to acknowledge trauma more than men? It's not clear what that means, but we think it's a risk factor. And being an ethnic minority usually is, because it probably tracks along with some of the other problems in terms of possible socioeconomic risk, but also just dealing with stigmatization and prejudice, which themselves are enormous stresses before a trauma and possibly after. There are ways to measure resilience. The most well-known is these are surveys. The Connors Davidson Resilience Scale measures traits, right? It measures, that's the idea of what kind of resilient characteristics does one have. We developed, sorry, they both say number one, but the Mount Sinai Resilience Scale, which measures behaviors, things that we think people can do to demonstrate and actually grow and promote their resilience in the face of trauma. So one is about traits, one is about behaviors, and so I'll pass those along. But the idea, which I'll get back to momentarily, is that there certain ways to act in the face of trauma that can promote one's resilience, which we certainly hope is the case, and that's what the second scale is about. Post-traumatic growth. If we were able to converse more, I would ask people if you've heard about post-traumatic growth, but this is the idea. If you recall that definition, and I gave you a resilience that I recommend, the third aspect of it was growing in the face of adversity, and that's what this idea is. The idea is one goes through a struggle, and then ideally, the struggle with a stress or a trauma comes out on the other end in some with some personal growth. Obviously, growth we think is good. Personal growth we think is good. Obviously, it would be nice to grow without going through a trauma. However, if one is, if life hands you a trauma, right, in a sense, it would be good if one could grow somehow from it. And that's what this shows. So in this graph, in this image, this green oval shows, the struggle, right? One is, dealing with the pandemic, or following an act of terrorism, or after a major, let's say hurricane, and or war, and one is struggling mentally to deal with it. And ideally, one if we could come out with this green trajectory here, which would mean kind of personal growth. That's the idea. But the other key idea here is the growth doesn't come without struggle, right? It's like, if you're familiar with the idea about physical exercise, no pain, no gain, this might be the psychological equivalent of that. And people that have studied, researchers that have studied post-traumatic growth break it up into 5 different dimensions. One is growing in the sense of personal strength. One is feeling how one relates to others. One is feeling more spiritual, and have a profound, growth existentially. 4 is like an appreciation of life, which is probably the one we're most familiar with, right? Just being, the idea of sort of being glad to be alive kind of idea. And 5 is new possibilities. In other words, seeing chances in one's life, or going after, or pursuing them, things that you might have been considering before the trauma that maybe you were, uneasy about, unsure about, hesitant about. Now you feel ready to pursue them, a job change, a move, proposing marriage or something like that. not new ideas necessarily, like all of a sudden I have all these ideas, but probably better ideas that you were sort of sitting on before. Now you sort of feel energized to pursue them, right? These are areas for post-traumatic growth. And here is, I think, a really important concept. If you think back to those different trajectories I showed you of PTSD symptoms after 9/11 and responders that I showed you from police and volunteers. So on the x-axis here are PTSD symptoms. And the y is post-traumatic growth. And what you'll see is, and this gets to the idea of struggle as well, for those who have lower PTSD symptoms, they're not as likely to grow or grow as much. But as PTSD symptoms increase, more likely to grow. And then as PTSD symptoms increase too much, the growth falls off again, right? So in a sense, just the right amount of trauma and not too much symptomatology is the sort of, I guess, sweet spot for the potential for growth. And so, right, so in here, we'd say is a struggle. Thankfully, this person doesn't have to struggle too much, people with these symptoms. Over here, people are probably struggling too much to grow. They're just needing to get by day by day. But right here in the middle, even if they actually have PTSD, if we diagnose them with, they still have the chance to grow more than those on the other side. To get to now the idea of resilience factors. So this gets to what I referred to earlier when I talked about our resilience scale, which is what things can one do or what things can one nurture in oneself to promote one's resilience. And my dean, who is also a psychiatrist, Dennis Charney, and his colleague, who's unfortunately since passed away, Steve Southwick, studied resilience way back in prisoners of war and in military special forces from the US, and particularly in prisoners of war from the Vietnam War, American prisoners of war, and then took these studies out into other populations to find out what made people resilient. And through these interviews, and also eventually even biological studies, came up with these 10 different resilience factors. Some of them are more about outlooks. Many of them are about behaviors, things that one can do. And so again, the idea is these are things that one can either act on or nurture in oneself, or identify in oneself in order to be more resilient. So let me see. So I'm going to go through some of them, but I'm not going to read all of them off, but I'm going to go through some of them as examples right now. So realistic optimism, right? So this is a quote that describes what it's about, but the idea is, we don't want blind optimism, right? Seeing everything through so-called rose-colored glasses. That's not resilience building. We also don't want to be overly pessimistic. So we want to sort of come somewhere in the middle, right? Someone who is being pessimistic gets stuck on the negative about a situation, but someone who is realistically optimistic or can promote realistic optimism in themselves sees the negative parts of a situation, but doesn't get stuck on them, focuses on the positive, right? If you're familiar with the phrase, the idea of sort of focusing on the lower hanging fruit, right? Focusing on the things that they can do something about rather than getting stuck on the things they can't do something about. That's the idea of realistic optimism. And here's a graph that kind of imagery that kind of just describes it, right? It's someone that is who's stuck in pessimism, try to see things in black and white, right? I will feel bad forever. Whatever happened, this will ruin everything. But someone who's realistically optimist, kind of dwells more in the grays of life, right? Rather than I will feel bad forever, I will feel bad for some time, but I will get past this, right? Or work is going to be hard, but everything else seems okay, right? So they're more into like sometimes, for now, lately, as opposed to always and never. What we might call the pessimist, or the person who engages in pessimism, kind of gets stuck in very overly rigid black and white thinking. All right. Then there's another resilience factor, active coping and facing fear. And these are some quotes from James Baldwin, is an American writer, was an American writer. Duke Ellington, and you may know, was a famous jazz musician, right? But kind of, there's great overlap between these resilience factors. But the idea here is that if there's something that's scaring you, if you don't do something about it, it's not likely to go away. And so if you're facing a challenge, so-called burying your head in the sand, or figuratively or literally going back to bed, doesn't make it go away, and possibly makes it worse. And so the idea is, and particularly from the James Baldwin quote, if you don't face something, you can't change it. We don't know if you face it if you can, but the percentages are better, right? So here, and I really should put a better graph here, but this is something called the Yerkes-Dodson graph, and developed, I think, in the early 20th century, or conceived in the early 20th century. And what it reflects on the x-axis is functioning, and on the y-axis, I'm sorry, I always get this backwards. The x-axis is anxiety, levels of anxiety, so worsening anxiety. The y-axis is function, doing whatever one is trying to do or supposed to do. Let's just say, you're doing what you need to do professionally. So some anxiety enhances our functioning. Too much anxiety impairs our functioning, right? So, and too little anxiety also is not good for our functioning. If there are some things, many things in life that if they didn't make us anxious, we wouldn't do them. Like, for example, my son just took some important final exams in high school. There's nothing fun about them. But if he wasn't anxious, he wouldn't have been able to, he wouldn't have had the energy to study as much. On the other hand, if he was super anxious, his ability to study might have been impaired because he'd be so distracted by the anxiety, right? So the idea here is to accept anxiety as natural and actually helpful, and I would say a different kind of fuel in the tank. And also, let me see if I can, And then this is a somewhat more complicated concept, but if you're familiar with the idea of cognitive therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, what that talks about is that we come into situations that certainly would be anxiety inducing or scary or challenging or distressing or saddening, but we come in with certain thoughts ahead of time that may predispose us to reacting in an unhealthy or unhelpful way, right? And so, and then maybe behaving in a certain way, and then this becomes a vicious cycle. So, I mean, just to give a basic example, somebody who is, let's say, on a dating app, and he thought he was going to have a date on tonight, let's say, with somebody, and that person suddenly disappears. They stop responding, right? I guess what we say these days here in the States, and maybe there, they were ghosted. So that, there are different ways to interpret that. But if the gentleman in this scenario who gets disappointed comes in with a predisposition to thinking people don't like him, right? And maybe he said, maybe his assumption is nobody likes me, right? That's his tendency to think that way, a very extreme thought. And then, right, and then this person, so-called ghosts them, then it just makes him feel worse. And he automatically interprets it as about him rather than the other person, rather than the possibility that other person got sick, right, or that the other person had a family member or some emergency, or the other person just dropped the ball, and then feels even worse about himself, and then that feeling more depressed about himself makes him think even more likely that nobody likes him, and it may also cause a potentially dysfunctional behavior, which is withdrawing from, let's say, dating apps, and then that's going to further confirm his belief that nobody likes him, because his chances for going on a date then get reduced even further, right? So the idea is to challenge these sort of extreme kind of black and white thoughts. And if you can see this graph, and I'm happy to share these slides afterwards, but we want to take the so-called negative cognitions on the left and reduce them, right? So you can see some of them are quite extreme. I don't deserve love. I'm a bad person. And we want to transform them into more positive ways of thinking, so-called positive cognitions. I deserve love. I can have love, etc. And in the end, in terms of facing fear, um, and not just dealing with our sort of overly rigid negative assumptions about ourselves or about life or about people, the basic idea with facing fear, the things that scare us, is to avoid avoiding. Getting back to that James Baldwin quote. So one way to act in a resilient way, one way to promote resilience, is to face the things that scare us, and we always put it as avoid avoiding, right? Thinking about fear as an opportunity, as our guide, like I said, anxiety points us in the direction of things that require our attention, right? I mean, most immediate example, concrete example would be I'm walking down the street in Manhattan, like I was this morning, and if I stepped off the curb and a taxi came too close to me, if I weren't anxious from it, I wouldn't step back, right? I mean, that's a very simplistic idea, but in that case, fear would definitely be a guide. Right? Another resilience factor, and this is one that probably, I think in some sense will seem like kind of common sense, but physical fitness and living well. I think it may sound simplistic to say, exercise. It may sound even naive to say to somebody, get in physical exercise right after a trauma or disaster. Um, after trauma, it's certainly not a time to start a new exercise regimen, but it is definitely a time. I mean, one could, if one, let's say, grew from the event and et cetera, but it would certainly be the idea to maintain a physical exercise regimen, and even it's an argument for having a physical exercise regimen in non-traumatic times. It's also important to have healthy eating and sleeping habits, which is, common sense, even under the best of times. But people actually need reminders to do these things. I remember going back to 9/11, um, we had what's called a family assistance center set up in a massive armory in Midtown Manhattan, and we had National Guardsmen there kind of manning the doors. And there was one guy who was there. I remember he was like standing at the door, kind of restless, hopping on his feet. He looked like he had just taken something like cocaine or drugs. He looked completely agitated and discombobulated. But it turned out, he'd been on duty for too long, and nobody had asked him to be on duty for that long. He just couldn't. He just couldn't pull himself away from being there and helping. But he was going to be completely useless if we actually needed someone to man that door. If we actually needed security to rise to the occasion if there was like another attack. So he needed to go home and get some sleep and have a decent meal. And I think this other idea of making your bed. There's a sort of famous graduation speech that was given by a retired admiral here in the States that talks about making your bed every day. And the idea is you wake up, you make your bed, you start your day in an orderly, proactive way, and no matter what happens at the end of the day, you come back and your bed is made. And you start out on a good foot, and you come back to something that's orderly and neat, and that hopefully sets the tone for your day, no matter what life brings you. This is another way, though, to think about sort of living well, and that's being aware of one's level of stress. And this is something from the U.S. military, so-called stress continuum model. And what the idea is to think about where one is at any given time on this scale, right? They think of it as ready, reacting, injured, and critical. But the idea green is things are going fine. You're feeling fine. No particular obstacles for you, at least internally, in terms of your stress level or your energy or your outlook. But then, if stress is building up, you might get into the yellow phase. And the details of these different ones are less important. But now you have a little bit of anxiety, maybe a little distracted. Then you get to the orange. Now you're more anxiety, more distracted. Now maybe you're not sleeping well. And then when you get to critical, that's when, maybe you need to see me, right? Maybe you developed a depressive disorder or you have PTSD or whatever, or a bad drinking problem or suicidal, right? And the idea is to monitor oneself and see where one's at. And we actually, I don't know if I have a slide about this. We, just to go back, we actually did a pilot, which we didn't really get to measure outcomes from, but with nurses here in New York during the part of the pandemic, having them pair up as so-called battle buddies, like the military uses it, pair up and monitor one another for where they were on this stress continuum. We actually even put this on little plastic placards that they could put on their behind their hospital IDs that hang from their from a clip on their shirts that they could look at and say, where am I on this, or where is my colleague? And then we gave them pointers for how to intervene on these different levels. I mean, this is just a quick thing, but if one is stressed out in the middle of one's day, right, there's this very, very quick, simple exercise called box breathing, which talks about doing diaphragmatic breathing, breathing deeply from one's diaphragm, and it's called a box because you kind of draw a box with your breathing. So you breathe normally for 4 seconds, you hold it for 4 seconds, you exhale for 4 seconds through your mouth, and then you pause for 4 seconds, then you inhale again for 4 seconds, and it's theoretically 16 seconds. And for many of us, and I myself do this, when you're tense or maybe even not tense and don't even realize it, tend to kind of hold your breath or breathe in this shallow fashion. And this is an example of sort of how the body affects the mind and vice versa. That kind of tension in the thorax and the abdomen probably promotes anxiety, certainly doesn't relieve it. So this is the kind of thing one can take a quick 16 seconds, probably have to do it a few times. Let's say you do it 3-4 times, it's a minute or so to kind of bring down one's stress level. That's like a basic sort of thing one can do in the middle of a very stressful day or traumatic moment. And this is recommendations from the U.S. government about how much exercise to get, which having about, I won't go into the details, and I'm not sure what the recommendations are in Germany, but this is the idea of having a regimen of good cardiovascular activity and some muscle strengthening activity every week. That just sets you up well for, in the face of stress or trauma. To keep going, and I'll wrap up shortly and take questions. The idea of social support. Let's see. Just very quickly, Dr. Charney and Dr. Southwick, they talked about that they studied prisoners of war from Vietnam after they were released. And what they learned is that some of them, when they were in solitary confinement and they would be stuck in solitary confinement, they would be taken away and tortured and brought back. They actually developed something called the TAP code, which is they learned how to basically create a code, which if we had more time, I'd show you what it looks like, where they would tap on the walls of their cells to communicate with each other. So they came up with a system for the letter A, for the letter B, etc. And they would talk with one another, and especially to provide support to an individual who just came back from being tortured, who may be in extreme pain and extremely lonely, may feel guilt if they revealed some, I guess, military secrets, etc. And they suggest that this TAP code is a extreme embodiment of the need for support when things are really bad. And so, social support, I alluded to it earlier, but it's definitely one of the best ways to recover from trauma. It's also one of the most available, and it's free, right? It's just the people around you. So, the ways to promote resilience through social support, of course, know who you can turn to for support. Put in some effort seeking support, right? Often people can't read our minds, or usually they can't. If we need support, we have to ask for it. And hopefully we are in work cultures or in communities where that's accepted or even encouraged. Giving support also actually feels good and helps people around you. And harder is how to build one's social network. And again, if we had more time, I could elaborate on these different ones. But this is how to promote resilience through social support. And also, I won't go into great detail here, but role models. Thinking of people that you think of as resilient is and that you can look up to as resilience role models goes a long way. And what this graph here shows is levels of depression in the face of a stress go down if one has resilient role models to look up to, right? It does affect one's ability, people that you can model yourself off of. This may be my last one. Faith, meaning, and spirituality, right? These are quotes from Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust. He borrowed some of this, I think, from the philosopher Nietzsche, I believe. But the idea is, what he talked about is people who are in the camps, the concentration camps. Of course, millions perish, but his observation was those who were most likely to survive were those who had a sense of purpose. All right, so the idea of having a why to live gives you kind of guides you for how to live, and whether that sense of purpose was sharing one's little meal with other people or planning out a religious service, secretly for people to attend. The bottom one, and some people dispute, but his feeling is that, it's not circumstances that makes life unbearable. It's one's lack of meaning and purpose. I know people can dispute that one, but it's certainly an inspiring idea. And of course, there's spirituality and religion, right? The idea, if one is, I'm amazed by how many people say, in countries I've visited, places I've worked, the fact, putting their faith in a God, God will get me through this. God knows what will happen, etc. Makes a big difference for people going through horrible, horrible things. And not everyone is religious, right? Which is a organized form of spirituality, or spiritual, feeling connected to things as much, to something bigger than themselves. But to the extent that one can be, and even get engaged in activities that are spiritual or religious, whether it's things like yoga, more spiritual forms of physical activity, or actually reading religious texts, or even connecting to nature, etc., is very helpful. Right? So the idea is, particularly number two. This is not so much about spirituality, but meaning. I like this one. When you're facing a challenge, ask yourself, what is life asking of me? Or what does life expect of me? All right. Kind of puts the ball in our court. Some people, again, challenge us when they're working, and like, for example, nurses in our health system feel like, well, it's not up to me. The challenge here is, why doesn't my hospital hire more nurses, or give me more pay, or give me more time off? Nonetheless, facing what one can do about a situation and trying to rise to the challenge, ideally, and do what one can within, let's say, sometimes difficult circumstances or difficult systems, is important. Well, I guess this is the last resilience factor. Having a moral compass, having an inner sense of what is right and what is wrong, is an important sense of a guide. So being attentive to what one's moral compass is and living according to it. There are actually ways to even train one's moral compass, but especially to be aware of what you value and what you consider right or wrong, and is extremely important under very difficult circumstances. And we talk a lot since the pandemic, for example, about moral injury. Certainly in times of war, we talk about moral injury, doing things that are against one's moral compass, because circumstances dictate it, and then how to heal from that. Okay, to wrap up and then leave some time for questions. So resilience can be defined in different ways, but all of them really are about weathering adversity and ideally growing from it. Thinking of it, I think, as a reserve someone has to deal with unanticipated challenges may also be helpful. Resilience, I didn't talk about the biological factors because we barely understand the biology of it, but it's certainly a mix of different psychological, even sociological, and biological factors. So it's a sort of a complex experience and element of human life and human existence. There are, we believe, a number of specific actions and ways of thinking that one can use to cultivate resilience. An important point, which I haven't made so far, I mentioned those 10 resilience factors, and I elaborated on a number of them, but one need not be resilient in all those ways. I just want to make sure I don't convey that. We're all different people. Some of us may be more prone to spirituality, may be more prone, more given to optimism, may have may have access to resilient role models or more support. It all depends, right? So one doesn't need to be like, all those. Ideally, one has certain strengths in some of those resilience factors. That's enough to make one overall so-called resilient. And I would just mention to you all, just on the personal level, going back to that original question I started with, what do you think is resilience? What do you think of, or what comes to your mind when you think of resilience? Just think about ideally one thing that you took away from today that you could use to build resilience in your own life. I mean, obviously, this is a very quick talk. I've kind of, tried to pack a lot of information into it, but maybe it's given you some pause to think about your own resilience, or those in your people around you at work or in your personal life, and maybe some food for thought.